And last but not least, in this Worst of the Skeptics series, for now at least, we have Matt Dillahunty, host of The Atheist Experience, who runs the gamut of excuses.
I guess I was calling about, a vegan diet and the morality of eating a vegan diet versus a meat diet.
Okay. I don't know what that has to do with atheism.
It actually is relevant if you consider human rights issues relevant to discussions about religion. I know Matt does consider human rights issues relevant, as he talks about the secular basis for morality frequently on his show. There are many parallels between atheism and veganism. Both are conclusions reached by questioning the status quo and deploying critical thinking and secular moral reasoning. Kim Socha wrote an amazing book on the religious origins of speciesism and the secular origins of anti-speciesism, called Animal Liberation and Atheism: Dismantling the Procrustean Bed.
Is the shark immoral for eating a fish?
No.
Why not?
Because that's its ecosystem, that's its life. We're smarter than the shark in a sense.
So what? What's that have to do with it?
I mean, it has a lot to do with it because we now have we know not to kill a fish. We know we can live without killing the fish. You know, the fish who's coming out of the water with a hook in its mouth and like gasping for life
is tasty.
Suffering. Sure, it's tasty, but so it's human, and so it's a lot of things.
I don't know whether or not humans tasty, but the point is,
humans taste like chicken.
If it's not immoral for the shark to eat a fish, you're saying it's immoral for me.
Sharks.
I'm aware that we're not sharks, but you're saying it's immoral for the shark, or not immoral for the shark to do it, but it's immoral for me to do it. Mm-hmm. I'm asking, what's the distinction?
Because we know better.
We don't know better. I don't know better. I don't know that it's immoral. You don't just, now you're just making an assertion.
Humans are not obligate carnivores. Meat is not necessary for our health or survival. The caller gives a frazzled but valid response, and Matt deflects to taste, and then repeats the question that the caller already answered. We know that we can live without killing fish.
And, would it then be wrong to eat insects who might suffer?
Mm-hmm. I agree with that too, though.
So you wouldn't want to eat insects either?
Not to eat insects.
Sure. Okay. No. Cool. How many animals die while we're farming the vegetables that we eat?
This is an appeal to futility. It is impossible to cause zero harm. Veganism is about minimizing harm. Besides, raising livestock requires more crops to be grown. Animal agriculture is incredibly inefficient in terms of calories. We could greatly reduce the agricultural land use and thus crop deaths by going vegan.
The question is it immoral to eat meat?
Yes.
So if I come across a dead animal on the side of the road, it's immoral for me to eat that?
No.
Oh, well then it's not immoral to eat meat. So now we're talking...
It's immoral to kill. It's immoral to kill an animal to eat it.
Right, but now we're talking about something else. So it's not the meat eating that is immoral.
No.
It is the killing. And I disagree with you, that I have no problem at all with killing to sustain life.
This isn't the gotcha he thinks it is. The fact that there are some contexts in which eating meat may be justifiable doesn't make the context in which you are eating meat justifiable. Meat is not necessary to sustain life in modern society. He directly contradicts what he said not even a minute earlier.
You can choose to have an herb-based diet. You can choose to have a plant-based diet. And if you live in the monumentally privileged West, you have access to all sorts of things that might make it easier.
Where do you live, Matt?
My view when it comes to morality is it's decidedly speciesist. It's undeniable, and I'm not at all bothered by that. When I say I'm speciesist, I don't see anything wrong with that. Okay?
You're right. I'm not a vegan. I'm an omnivore. And I am biased toward my species, and I draw an arbitrary line there. And I draw other arbitrary lines.
Admitting you are okay with drawing arbitrary lines here is admitting you are okay with being logically inconsistent. He sounds like a devout Christian who is perfectly satisfied with the answer, God works in mysterious ways. Oh, my views are inconsistent? Whatever, that's fine with me. Proudly wearing the label speciesist is like proudly wearing the label racist.
So do you know the difference between a moral virtue and a moral obligation?
Moral obligation? No, I guess I don't.
Okay, so let's say there's a kid standing out in the road and there's a bus coming, and you have the opportunity to rescue that kid without putting yourself at risk at all. You can make a good argument that you have a moral obligation to rescue that kid because there's zero risk, everything else. If the bus is really close and you would be putting yourself at risk, it would be morally virtuous of you to rescue that kid, but you're not necessarily under an obligation anymore. You're under a moral obligation to not run around killing people, but you're not under a moral obligation to never tell a lie, although that might in fact be virtuous. It may in fact be morally virtuous to not eat animals, but I don't see it as a moral obligation. That said, there are certainly problems with meat industry that I object to, where we may be doing harm to the planet in some cases. But what I find most of the time when I talk to especially ethical vegans is that there's a gross oversimplification because they've been, listening to Peter Singer or whoever just talk about a simplified view of morality that's about suffering.
Matt has no actual argument as to what makes veganism a virtue rather than an obligation. His example of the kid and the bus only proves our point that veganism is an obligation, because we incur no risk by being vegan. Why is it that we have a moral obligation not to run around killing people, but we don't have a moral obligation to never tell a lie? Could it be that killing people causes direct harm, but a white lie doesn't? So let's talk virtues versus obligations. Veganism is not an act of charity, it is a non-action. You are choosing not to contribute to the suffering of animals. If not causing harm is the moral baseline, being vegan is an obligation, whereas running a sanctuary and rescuing animals would be morally virtuous. It's like walking past a homeless person and not punching them in the face versus giving them a $20 bill. Perhaps we are not morally obligated to give money to the homeless, but we are certainly morally obligated to not harass them. It can be tricky deciphering what is a virtue versus an obligation if you read Peter Singer's essay on charity being an obligation. But if we set the moral baseline higher, as we probably should, veganism remains a moral obligation.
Now, I had a long discussion with Alex O'Connor, 2 hours, and a good chunk of it was about morality, and some portion of it was about animal rights and veganism and stuff like that. And it was an off-the-cuff conversation where I hadn't bothered to look into things. Alex made some of these points talking about how going vegan may be the best thing you can do to actually fight climate change. And he cited a number of references. Obviously, we're just sitting on a couch and we didn't have time to look into it. I've since had some time to look into it. And while there is some validity to the points that he was making, there are also objections to those points, which I haven't studied up on and don't have a way to go through it. If it turns out that eating meat, the process by which we go about it, et cetera, is ultimately going to kill us all, whether it's through climate change or whatever else, then of course we should stop doing that. The problem is that I'm not yet convinced that's the case. Other people are. Where we draw the line is something we're still working on. And I'm not where you are necessarily yet, and this is not my issue, so I haven't spent much time on it.
At this point, Matt is acting in bad faith by choosing to remain ignorant. While agriculture is not the #1 cause of climate change, eliminating animal products from our diet is the single biggest way that we as individuals can reduce our eco-footprint. But it doesn't have to be the case that eating meat will literally kill us all for it to be morally obligatory to stop. We are slaughtering trillions of animals, causing pain and suffering to sentient beings, for reasons that are entirely unnecessary. That alone is reason enough to be vegan. But it also happens to be the case that our consumption of animal products is driving deforestation, ocean dead zones, methane emissions, and pandemics. Animal agriculture is an extremely inefficient way to feed the human population because of the amount of land and water it requires. Our excess consumption of resources will quite literally kill us all if we don't change course.
One of the things to consider is what's the impact on humans if I stop eating meat?
Sure, so for instance, eating the agricultural industry,
farmers, ranchers, truckers, all of them lose business.
It's also,
and that contributes to the greater good of humans.
What do you think contributes more to the greater good of humans? Either making sure those people keep their jobs, or combating climate change?
Oh, well, now we've jumped into another realm.
For the reasons I just listed, among others, eating animals is clearly detrimental to our own species. Alex gracefully explains that jobs, though, is not a valid justification for preserving barbaric industries and practices. The same argument was made in favor of human slavery. Freeing slaves would hurt the economy. He brings up climate change in response to Matt's question about the impact ditching animal products would have on humans. And Matt says, now we've jumped into another realm. The king of red herrings is accusing Alex of changing the subject, when, in reality, this is not another realm at all. It was a direct response to his question.
I think what I've seen from some ethical vegans just have, garbage argument, and so do some atheists, and so do I on some stuff, I'm sure. But even amongst the best, they seem to devalue the impact to one's life with regard to financial costs, time costs, pleasure. Now, at no point would I ever suggest that the mere pleasurable experience somebody might have with doing something becomes the overriding factor of whether or not it's moral. But I also would never say that it's irrelevant.
No, we don't undervalue taste pleasure and free time. We simply acknowledge that the suffering of animals carries more weight than our personal inconvenience. Also, it is a misconception that vegan food is bland and laborious. Being vegan doesn't actually require the grand sacrifice that you think it does.
First of all, I'm not in favor of animal cruelty, and people will say, well, if you're not for animal cruelty, then you should be a vegan because it's cruel to kill an animal. Well, yeah. Yes, but I think that there's a humane, responsible way to do it. If you want to say I should be on board with making changes to the meat farming and manufacturing industry, I'm on board with that. I'm in favor of making changes.
Am I opposed to many of the harmful practices of factory farming and everything else? Yes.
If I gave you the opportunity to say, here's a way to make it such that every single time you have a meal, you can make sure that it is not a factory farmed animal that is on your plate, would you take it?
Yes.
Okay, that option is available to you right now.
Cool.
Right now.
And you're going to say that it's to not eat meat?
Yeah.
Yeah. The thing is, there's a presumption in the way you phrase the question to begin with that makes for an inequality. Because what I'm actually comparing there is there a way for me to eat meat where I don't have any of the immoral problems of factory farming? And that, I think, is possible as well, as far as I can tell. As somebody who's done every step in the process from killing all the way up to cooking and eating.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's possible, but the fact of the matter is that almost every single meal that you ever have that isn't specifically prepared by yourself or someone you know, in fact, I would say probably all of the meals that you have, like in a restaurant, let's say, come from the factory farm. And if you said a moment ago that you're almost convinced that is just objectively wrong, the factory farming industry. If it's the case that every single time you go to a restaurant, that's where your food's coming from, then it's not difficult to just choose something else on the menu.
Sure.
So why don't you do it?
Who said I don't?
Well, I mean, have you eaten meat in a restaurant in the past week?
I ate crab today at a restaurant.
Yeah. So that means that you don't. That means that.
Well, I don't think that the crab was factory farmed or harmed or in the sort of immoral suffering that we're talking about.
I mean, like, have you eaten pork in the past week at that was not prepared by yourself or a friend in the kind of ethical manner that you're speaking of?
I was going to say probably not in the last week because I don't actually eat much, I actually have because last night at the Thai restaurant I had pork.
Okay, or we could just rephrase it to say, do you think it's immoral for someone to do so? Or whatever. Like, there's a situation where you have contributed to an industry that you've already said you think is almost certainly objectively wrong.
Yeah.
But you've done so in such a way that could have been so easily rectified, just so easily by just choosing something else on the menu.
However, is it the case that we couldn't make improvements such that those industries are no longer major contributing factors to climate change, and yet still have those industries.
And not practically, no. Especially because a lot of the emissions come from the animals themselves. So
those animals aren't going to go away when we stop eating them.
Well, no, yes, they are. I mean, once the demand... So there are currently unthinkable numbers of animals that are specifically being bred to be tortured and slaughtered. If the demand goes down, then they simply just won't be born anymore. And so the animals aren't going to go extinct.
So maybe the better solution is to do like a Thanos snap and eliminate half the human beings. Because now that fundamentally changes.
Well,
and I'm not. I realize I'm half smiling, and I'm not trying to be glib.
Yeah, that's not frivolous. But the reason why I wouldn't accept an argument like that is because the whole context in which we're talking about this, and the reason I brought it up is because you said a second ago, when you're making the choice about whether to eat meat and stuff, you say, well, how is it that going vegan is going to affect human beings and my welfare? Well, obviously, getting rid of half of the population, or even just solving the overpopulation crisis, let's say, is not like. If you just kill half of the people on the planet, that's not good for human well-being.
See, and I'm not convinced we have an overpopulation crisis.
Okay, but even if we don't, you could say that one way to combat climate change would be to cut the population in half. Well, sure, another way to combat climate change would be
driving cars.
Would be to stop driving cars. But an even better way than both those things probably put together is to stop eating meat.
Let's review the definition of lip service, shall we? An avowal of advocacy, adherence, or allegiance expressed in words but not backed by deeds. As for there being a better way to go about it, animal farming is inherently unethical and with a growing population, unsustainable. Compared to plant farming, it is much more resource intensive. The idea that we can somehow sustainably farm animals without a massive reduction in supply and thus a massive spike in price is a fantasy. The idea that we can somehow humanely farm animals is a misunderstanding of the word humane. To have or show compassion or benevolence towards animals means to view them as individuals, not commodities. To consider what is in their best interest rather than how they can serve us.
I mean, I'm not trying to...
Well, no, it seems what you're trying to do is to call in and talk about morality when you really wanted to talk about veganism.
Well, but I'm saying I see a moral contradiction in these.
And I don't.
See how you...
And I don't, and I've explained it many, many times, including that conversation with Alex. Have you watched that conversation?
What a giant man baby. Veganism is an ethical stance against the exploitation of animals. It has everything to do with morality. Animal rights are just as relevant to atheism as human rights issues, which Matt will happily engage with. He dismisses veganism because it triggers his cognitive dissonance. I have watched his conversation with Alex, and he spent the entire 2 hours dancing around the point, as he does in the clips I provided.
Because I was supposed to do a video on what my views on the issue are, because everybody gets it wrong and makes just outlandish claims about my views. Unfortunately, I've been in bed with the flu, so I haven't done that video. I'm going to be putting together a video that perhaps goes through in better detail what my view is, because this is the trail we go down every time.
I got you. I just want to be clear because somebody's going to soundbite something and go, oh, look.
Of course, yeah.
It's been years, and I have yet to see such a video. Please, Matt, if you're watching this, I would love to see you attempt to justify your position in a concise format. It would be much easier to respond to. This video was such a headache to organize because his responses are so incredibly incoherent and disorganized. He complains about vegans taking him out of context, so I wanted to leave you with a raw, uncut clip from his call with Christian from Ohio to demonstrate how messy and contradictory his thought process is. My splicing and piecing together clips in this video was not an attempt to misrepresent him by removing context. It was a genuine attempt to organize his incoherent ramblings.
My view of morality involves essentially a contract that is based on the notion of moral virtues and moral obligations. There are cases where if you don't take a certain action, it is necessarily immoral, and there are other cases where it's not immoral to not take the action, but it may be morally virtuous. If there's a kid standing in the street and a bus is coming, and it will cost me nothing and I'm at no risk to reach out and grab that child and pull them in, I would argue that I have a moral obligation, a moral duty to do that. But if it would involve me putting myself at risk, I may not have a moral duty, but it might still be morally virtuous of me to make that attempt. It might even be morally virtuous of me to sacrifice my own life in order to save that other person. And so with those differences, I have a moral contract that is undeniably speciesist. I draw a line at independent species because just because there's a human being who's maybe brain doesn't function even on the level of a grasshopper. That doesn't mean that they're not that they are without value, because they have value to other humans, et cetera. I'm willing to extend that and to extend different rights and different moral contracts to a variety of different species. I'd put dolphins and great apes and other stuff in a completely different category from grasshoppers. And anybody who doesn't, I think, is nuts. But where we draw the line, and I could be wrong. I'm not saying that as a dismissal of the thing. Where we draw the line is something we're still working on. And I'm not where you are necessarily yet, and this is not my issue, so I haven't spent much time on it.
Oh, yeah, that's fair, and I understand. But I just have kind of a question. You said you would recognize that not eating meat is probably a morally more virtuous position.
No, I didn't say anything at all about not eating meat probably being a more virtuous position. I said that it may be the case that not eating meat is the more morally virtuous position.
It maybe you don't think that that's kind of obvious?
No. You could be a more morally virtuous person if you don't eat meat, but that doesn't mean that I am an immoral person for eating meat. Do you think that eating meat is immoral?
Not if you need to.
Okay.
But
what if you just want to? Is it immoral then?
I would argue if you have other options, if you're in an industrialized society, then yes, because you're knowingly choosing to do something that's causing harm to conscious beings.
So, no, I'm not. No, I'm not. Eating meat does not cause harm to conscious beings. If I find a deer on the side of the road and I eat that, I didn't cause that deer any harm. So is eating meat immoral?
Eating meat if the animal was dead due to natural causes, no. But if you are
so we're in agreement. Merely eating meat is not immoral. And so now the question becomes, when does it become immoral? And that's something that I'm not necessarily convinced of. Am I opposed to many of the harmful practices of factory farming and everything else? Yes. Am I opposed to somebody going out into their 400 acres and shooting a deer and eating it? No.
So essentially what you're saying is, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying that it depends on the context of in which you're eating meat.
Well, the eating meat part is irrelevant. It's the other actions that contribute to moral questions, not the eating of the meat.
But you don't think that it's kind of obvious that...
I don't give it... Okay, let's stop right now. Kind of obvious is not an argument. It's an assertion of opinion. I want arguments and evidence, not it's kind of obvious, because clearly it's not kind of obvious to me.
Yo, how when me eat them, I wonder when me eat. When me tell them say me nah eat no fish, nah no meat now. How when me eat them, I wonder when me yam. When me tell them say that I'm a vegan man. How when me eat them, I wonder when me eat.